Welcome to Wife Cheating Story. I hope you have an enjoyable and relaxing time listening. Let's get started.
I felt the weight of the day press against my shoulders before I even stepped onto the patio. It was my birthday, a word that tasted like ash on my tongue. Laughter bounced around the courtyard, light and careless, carried on the warm afternoon breeze. My wife, Simone, gleamed under the string of twinkling lights, the center of every delighted glance her friends cast her direction. 3 of her girlfriends surrounded her like polished pearls, their smiles wide, their glasses raised in unison. They leaned in toward one another, sharing private jokes at my expense. I carried a single slice of chocolate cake, my favorite she had baked herself. The icing was soft and sweet, bitter irony, and it slid in my hand like a neon sign of my own hopeful stupidity. I offered it to her. For a moment, the world paused, and the cake felt heavy, like a stone of all my past efforts crushing me. Her lips curled into a slow, knowing smirk as she turned her glass toward me and clinked it with those of her friends. The sound felt like a hammer against my chest. "You're a nobody," Simone said, voice clear as crystal, sharp enough to cut steel. I swallowed, tasting sugar and salt and despair. The word echoed in my mind, pounding against every dream I had. "You fix toilets. You think that makes you a man?" Her friends laughed, a bubbling cacophony that wrapped around me and squeezed. I thought I might sink into the table, vanish under the weight of their mockery. I looked down at the cake, the dark crumb flaking onto my work shirt, staining the image of a man who could provide, repair, build, mend. But not this. Not humiliation. I didn't speak. I didn't fling the cake or slam the table. I just stood there until the next blow came, slow and measured. "Well, it's time you knew the truth," she continued, her voice a gentle snare. "You were always just temporary." Temporary. She stretched the word like a blade. The air shifted, heavy and cold, as if the sun had been swallowed by a moonless night. I felt something inside me catch fire and die, piece by piece. Then, beneath the laughter, a spark of something else flickered. Not anger. Not yet. Cold clarity. I folded my hands around the plate and slipped it back onto the table as if placing a sacred relic I never deserved. I felt the moisture in my palms, the tremor that threatened to give me away, but I held it together. Each breath measured, each heartbeat a hammer. Simone's friends floated closer, drawn by the promise of drama. Their eyes glittered with anticipation, but I gave them nothing to feast on. I gave them my silence. Without a word, I turned away. Each step felt like I was walking through water, submerged in the humiliation I tried so hard to banish. I crossed the threshold into our home, the laughter barreling toward me like a tidal wave. Behind me, Simone's voice echoed, but it was as distant as a memory. In the bedroom, I found my duffel bag. I packed only what I needed, work boots scuffed by countless gutters and drains, the blue shirt she once said made me look gentle, my trusty wrench set, heavy and comforting in its old leather pouch. Each item represented a fragment of the man I had believed myself to be. My phone buzzed against the dresser, a staccato reminder of everything I was leaving behind. 29 missed calls. None from Simone. My heart stuttered at the thought, but I didn't look. I didn't have to. I knew what was there. She didn't want connection. She wanted an ending. I paused at the doorway, the bag slung over one shoulder, and I looked back at the life I had tried so hard to build. The framed photos of our wedding day. The bookshelf weed filled with shared dreams. I could almost hear my own laughter, a ghost of memory dancing between the walls. And then I realized it wasn't my laugh anymore. It was hers. The cool touch of the doorknob was the sound of freedom and pain. They came together, a symphony of loss and potential. I stepped outside and closed the door with a measured click. The world beyond was wide and uncharted, a road that bent and turned, offering both the promise of escape and the weight of unknown consequences. The air carried the scent of jasmine from the garden, sweet and biting, like hope laced with regret. I should have felt relief, but I felt only the hollow ache where my heart had been. I hoisted the bag higher and walked to the truck. Each footfall on the gravel was deliberate. There was no trembling now. There was no begging. There was only the man I had been and the man I would become. I slid into the driver's seat and gently lifted the wrench pouch onto the passenger side. I placed my hands on the wheel, knuckles white. The engine roared to life. I reversed slowly, not looking back, not even once. I needed the road ahead, not the memories behind. I drove for 20 minutes before my phone buzzed again. A text message. None from Simone. A voicemail icon blinked next to my name. My daughter, Sierra, miss me, it said. I closed my eyes. I imagined her small hands gripping mine, her giggle like sunlight. The thought warmed me, but it did not break the resolve building in my chest. I pulled onto the highway, the asphalt stretching before me like a river. I didn't have a destination. I only had the distance. And sometimes, distance was the sharpest healing tool a man could wield. With one last look at the taillights fading in the rearview mirror, I let the highway swallow me. I pushed the accelerator further than I ever thought I would on a night I never planned to last. The city lights blurred past me in splashes of neon and faded to nothing as I crossed into the dark expanse beyond. My knuckles were white around the wheel, and the hum of the engine felt like a heartbeat echoing in my chest. Simone's laughter rang behind me like a warning. Gas stations appeared under flickering lights, their pumps alive with the desperation of travelers filling leaky tanks. I paid cash, its crumpled bills sliding across the counter like worthless tokens. The receipt showed us something I didn't want to think about as I stepped back into the night. After hours on two-lane highways lined with scrub and telephone poles, I turned onto a cracked gravel road that led to a small motel near Edison Creek. Spare rooms. Vacancy. Room 7. The neon sign buzzed in the damp air. I parked and grabbed my bag, each footstep crunching against the gravel. Inside, the desk clerk slid me a tarnished key without speaking. I carried it up narrow stairs that protested under my weight. The room was a relic of neglect. Wallpaper bubbled at the seams. The carpet bore stains that told stories I refused to imagine. A single lamp flickered beside a bed whose springs groaned the moment I sat. In the corner, the bathroom door hung off its hinge, and mildew clung to every surface like an unwelcome reminder. It was fine. I didn't plan to stay long. I set my duffel on the edge of the bed and kicked off my boots, the cold hitting my bare feet like a slap. My wrench set lay waiting inside the pouch I had packed. Each tool was a promise I could still fix something in this world. I lay back and stared at the stained ceiling. The neon vacancy sign blinked in the darkness. Vacancy. Vacancy. It pulsed like a cruel heartbeat. My mind drifted through the afternoon's humiliation. Nobody. Temporary. Her words echoed until the edges of my anger went numb. I opened my eyes and spotted a small window overlooking a gravel lot. Beyond it, broken lawn chairs and rusted barrels lay scattered. A distant street lamp cast a sickly glow on tree silhouettes. I wondered if anyone would come looking for me, or if I would remain here until the sun burned away the shadows. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. More missed calls. Voicemails blinking at me. I slid it face down without checking. I didn't need apologies I didn't intend to give. Silence stretched in the room, and I let it fill me. I rose and walked to the sink, its basin chipped and stained. Water sputtered when I turned the tap before running clear, then stopping altogether. I knelt and tightened the pipe below, listening to the satisfying click as the leak sealed. Flow restored. Leaks fixed. I straightened and felt a flicker of pride. Back on the bed, I sat upright, wrench in hand. The tools felt heavy with potential. Pipes and pumps responded to force and precision. People did too, if you knew which valves to turn. Simone had turned mine until I fractured under the pressure. Now it was my turn. I lay down again, wrapping my fingers around the thin sheet. The clock glowed 3:14 a.m. In her home, she would be asleep beside Victor, dreaming of her perfect life. I stared at the ceiling until I felt my eyelids grow heavy. Morning light seeped through the curtains, weak and pale against the grime. I shuffled downstairs, the lobby empty except for the clerk half awake behind the counter. The coffee machine gurgled in the corner, a single mug in hand. The aroma was harsh but welcome. Back in the room, I sat at the rickety desk and opened a small notebook. My pen hovered before I began writing. Gather evidence on Victor Alonso, verify restaurant ownership and liabilities. Contact Petrov for financial trails. Prepare anonymous tips for inspectors. Secure legal counsel. Arrange a meeting with my lawyer about divorce. Plan weekends with Sierra. Each line felt like armor, like a map out of the wreckage. I folded the paper, tucked it into my shirt pocket, and rested my hand on my wrench pouch. I stood by the window and watched the gravel lot slowly brighten. The neon vacancy sign flickered off, its glow replaced by the soft hues of dawn. Other guests might check out soon, but I had no intention of lingering. I picked up my duffel, slung it over my shoulder, and paused by the door, taking one last look at the battered room. It felt less like a cell and more like a workshop, a place where broken things went in and came out stronger. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew and possibility. I turned the key, the engine roaring like promise, and exhaled years of doubt. The highway stretched onward, each mile a testament to resolve. Tomorrow, the world would know my name. I placed the notebook on the seat beside my wrench set and climbed into the truck. As I pulled away, the motel receded in the rearview mirror, a silent witness to my rebirth. I woke before sunrise, the pale light slanting through the dusty window of the room I now called home. My truck was parked below, its windows fogged with condensation, a loyal companion on this solitary journey. I slipped into my boots without lacing them all the way, wincing at the stiff leather, then hoisted my duffel bag over my shoulder and crept out the door. Petrov's garage sat a few blocks away, a squat red brick building with a sagging sign that read Petrov's Auto and Plumbing. Inside, it was warm and smelled of diesel and motor oil mingled with the clean, metallic tang of new copper pipe. Old friend or not, Petrov didn't greet me with warmth. He merely nodded and motioned toward the narrow staircase at the back. No leases, no receipts, no questions. Just a handshake and a monthly envelope placed on his cluttered desk. Upstairs, my room was smaller than the motel, but it was mine. The walls were cinder block gray, the floor concrete, and a single bulb hung from a frayed cord overhead. I set my duffel on the chipped wooden chair by the window, tugged out my wrench set, and arranged the tools neatly on the battered desk. Ray Dalton. No social, no digital trace was born in that moment. I splayed my new identity across a sheet of notepaper. Name, phone number, 2 references I'd forged from local names I'd collected months ago. No connection to Mason Riley. No history. I folded the paper, slid it into the pocket of my faded work jacket, and tucked my driver's license deep in the bag. Morning light streamed through the skylight as the garage door rumbled upward. A big rig rolled in first, and Petrov barked orders to shift this, drain that, hose the oil pan. His mechanics moved with practiced precision, but none spoke to me. I was the new plumber, a service he could bill at higher rates because few did both mechanical and plumbing repairs. My first assignment was under the hood of a delivery truck with coolant leaking from a cracked radiator. I knelt on the concrete floor, chasing a drip that formed a perfect, steady bead before splatting against the jackstand. I felt the familiar weight of my wrench in my hand, and, for the first time since I left Simone, something like peace settled behind my ribs. Ray, Petrov called from the front office. I've got a guy who needs a hand. Clogged drain, customer's mom called. Southside. He tossed me a slip with the address scrawled in hurried pen. I stuffed it in my pocket and wiped grease from my arms on an old rag. As I climbed into my truck, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the reflection of a man who no longer recognized his own eyes. But those eyes burned with purpose. The address was a modest bungalow 2 neighborhoods over from the main drag near Edison Creek. An elderly woman greeted me at the door, clutching a handkerchief to her nose. Water pooled at her feet like a tidal wave. She invited me in with trembling thanks, and I knelt under the sink, my flashlight bobbing against the underside of the countertop. The U-bin was full of hair and grime, nothing I hadn't faced before. In 20 minutes, the water drained smoothly down the pipe and the fountain ceased. I cleaned up, collected my fee in crisp 20s, and on my way out, slipped a few coins and a handwritten note inside a kitchen drawer. The note read, "If you ever need help or see anything odd, call this number." I didn't ask questions. I didn't sign it. The anonymity felt righteous. Back at the garage, I sorted through Petrov's stack of job requests. One name caught my eye, Victor Alonso. The address was downtown, where the city's aspirations and secrets often met. Simone's so-called boyfriend, the restaurant owner she flaunted. I slid the card across the desk to Petrov, who glanced at it and shrugged. Gourmet bistro. High rollers eat there. That was all the confirmation I needed. The palace Simone had built with another man's applause. Over the next few days, I honed my routine. Morning oil changes and brake repairs, afternoons unclogging toilets and repairing leaking faucets. I answered the calls as Ray with no hesitation, no lingering glance at my caller ID. I learned names and routines. Mr. Hawthorne preferred thick pipes under his sink. Mrs. Delgado's water heater hissed at precisely 4 a.m. I fixed their problems quietly, collected payment, and logged each job on my clipboard. But somewhere in my pocket lay Victor's address, a promise of truth-awaiting exposition. Curiosity tugged at me as I climbed into the passenger seat of a friend's sedan one Tuesday afternoon. Petrov's cousin worked at the city records office, a favor owed for a free tune-up. I followed Petrov's cousin through the maze of filing cabinets, and for an hour, I copied names, licenses, corporate registrations, and tax filings related to Victor Alonso's restaurants. 2 of them were strapped with liens for equipment loans. One claimed as profit what had actually vanished into shell corporations. My penbot filled pages with numbers, dates, and notarized signatures that told the story Simone never bothered to discover. That night, I returned to the bungalow to retrieve the note, expecting nothing more than a phone number written on a scrap. But the drawer lay empty, and in its place was a small crumpled envelope addressed to me, Ray Dalton. Inside was a single line. Keep going. No signature, no flourish. Just the whisper of an ally. I lay awake on the thin mattress listening to the hum of the street lamps through the window. I thought about Simone laughing behind the bistro's curtain, swirling wine in that crystal glass I once polished by hand. I thought about the debts hidden in corporate ledgers, the skeletons beneath the polished menus, and the lines I drew in the sand. This is where I start. Tomorrow, I would offer my services at the flagship bistro. I wouldn't give my real name. I wouldn't uncover my plan. I would simply bend the pipe and see what leaked through. In the dim glow of the room, I found my wrench and held it like a sword. Mason Riley was gone, but Ray Dalton would carve a new identity from the broken bones of betrayal. I closed my eyes, the single note burning in my pocket, and felt the first flicker of something long forgotten, conviction. When the sun rose, I would step into Victor's domain and begin drafting the blueprint of his downfall, one swing of the wrench, one secret uncovered at a time. And I would do it quietly, efficiently, with the precision of a man who knew exactly what he was fixing. The morning I walked toward Victor Alonso's flagship bistro, the sky was a slate gray canvas, pregnant with rain that never fell. I felt the weight of purpose settle into my shoulders as I carried the toolbox Petrov had lent me. Pipes, wrenches, sealant tape, and the notebook where I'd scribbled every lien and fictitious corporate registration I'd uncovered. The sign above the front door gleamed bronze letters on black enamel, Alonso's. It looked expensive, like a promise of fine dining and stifled laughter, but I knew the cracks lay just beneath that glossy finish. I paused at the curb, glancing in the window where a maitre d' fussed over napkins and menus. His starched collar and tie told me all I needed to know. Presentation mattered to these people. Image mattered more. Finally, I squared my shoulders, tucked my wrench under my arm, and stepped across the threshold. The hostess glanced up from her ledger, confusion flickering before she recovered. "Mr. Alonso sent for me," I said, extending a business card that bore the name Ray Dalton and the tagline, "Dalton Plumbing and Maintenance." The faux serif font read like trust itself, and I watched her eyebrows rise, a tiny crack in her poise. She slid the card into a leather folder and pointed down a short hall past gleaming tile floors and abstract art pieces. When I reached the kitchen door, a rush of steam and sizzling oil hit me like a wave. Victor stood by a service table, clipboard in hand, surveying a half-empty room. He dropped a nod when I entered. His apron was pristine, though his sharp eyes belied impatience. "I hear you do good work," he said, voice low, a mix of command and curiosity. "My drain's backing up, and I need it fixed fast." I knelt beside the stainless steel drain rack, listening to the rumble of water like a distant storm. My gloves snapped snug around my fingers. I undid the grate and peered into the murky abyss, spotting the grease globules that congealed like shadows. I loosened the trap with my wrench and let the stagnant water sluice into a bucket. While I worked, I studied Victor's posture, tight jaw, restless gait. A man who lived by the letter of his ledger, not by genuine flavor or service. "Grease trap's oversized," I said, tightening the bolts. "It's efficient for volume, but you're flushing wastewater into the line too fast. You need a flow restrictor or a second trap downstream." He frowned, ticking the suggestion on his clipboard. "Costly." I met his gaze, the world narrowing to the two of us under that fluorescent light. "Worth it. Otherwise you'll see more fines, maybe a shutdown order." I handed him a printed estimate, gloves smudged, corners curled. He examined it briefly, then tore off the top sheet and slid it back across the counter. "I'll do it," he said. "Tomorrow morning, before breakfast service." I nodded. 7 o'clock. As I packed my tools, I let the trap cover fall shut with a decisive clack. My mind traced the breadcrumbs I'd laid so carefully. The flagship bistro was built on lines of credit and phantoms, companies that existed only on paper, loans taken, and collateral vanished. Two of Alonzo's restaurants teetered under liens for kitchen equipment. The third was a hollow shell masquerading as profit. I'd read the corporate filings in Petrov's cousin's office on Tuesday, the notarized ledgers exposing how the money flowed out of his enterprises into private accounts overseas. I returned the next morning at 7 sharp, wearing fresh coveralls and a tape measure clipped to my belt. The street was quiet, the world still slumbering except for the early crew dragging crates of vegetables through the alley. I tapped on the side door, and a burly prep cook let me in, muttering about early inspections. I nodded and followed him into the prep area, where I installed the secondary grease trap as recommended, retrofitting the drain line with new seals and clamps. My hands worked methodically, each twist of the wrench a reminder of how precision could dismantle a man's empire. When I finished, I cleaned the area with industrial solvent, no trace of spilled oil or fingerprints. Then I slipped 2 pinhole cameras into the kitchen ceiling vent and the breaker box in the back office, concealing them against the humming coils. I tested each with my phone's video feed, green lights blinking like conspirators. In the back office, I cracked open the fuse panel and replaced a single fuse with a look-alike wired to trip under slight overload. It would take weeks before it blew and triggered an investigation. I wiped my fingerprints off the metal with an alcohol swab and left like a shadow at midnight. Over the next few days, I checked the footage. The expired fish arrived in crates stamped with yesterday's date. Dishes labeled fresh catch lingered in display coolers an hour past health code limits. Workers, some not old enough for driver's licenses, navigated prep stations with bare arms and dripping sinks. They cleaned plates without gloves, skimming cash tips into pockets faster than servers could claim them. And there, in the back office's mahogany chair, sat Simone, hands folded in her lap, swirling wine from a crystal glass I'd engraved with our anniversary date. Her laughter was low and triumphant, as if she reveled in a victory I'd never see. Each time I watched, I memorized faces, dates, places, every detail and nail in the coffin of Victor's facade. I arranged anonymous tips. One to the health department with screenshots of mold creeping on the walk-in cooler, another to labor with photos of underage workers, a third to the IRS with copies of his Shellcorp filings. I sent each from encrypted emails, then watched as inspectors descended in waves. The flagship bistro closed for a week. Fines piled up like headstones. Through it all, I remained Ray. No link to Mason Riley. No sliver of empathy or hesitation. I was a repairman by trade, an avenger by design. And with every inspection report that landed in my inbox, I felt the foundations of Victor's empire quake. The cracks in the paint widened, revealing the rotting wood beneath. I stood one evening outside Alonzo's, the neon sign dead after dark, mist swirling at my feet. I pulled the cameras from their hiding spots, metal cold in my palms. I wiped them clean and stored them in my duffel, souvenirs of a truth some had tried to bury. Simone might have thought she'd build a palace for herself, but palaces crumble when the mortar washes away. Tomorrow, I'd move on to the next restaurant in her bragged about lineup. I'd pose as the plumber again, bringing my wrench and my cameras, digging deeper into the whispers I'd collected from grateful cooks and panicked inspectors. Each job would be another stroke of quiet destruction, another whisper in the halls of justice. I drove away under the wash of streetlights, the notebook with my notes brimming in my jacket pocket. In my rearview mirror, the sign flickered one final time before surrendering to darkness. I thought of Simone's smirk and of that slice of cake I'd held like a sacrament before reality shattered. The cracks were everywhere now, in the paint, in her plans, in the illusion she'd created. I tightened my grip on the wheel and let the road swallow me once more. Mason Riley had lost his home, his wife, his identity, but in the wreckage, he'd found a new purpose. And Ray Dalton was just getting started. Night crept over Alonzo's flagship bistro like a velvet curtain, and I slipped through the service entrance just as the last dinner plates clattered in the kitchen. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on stainless steel surfaces. Everything here was clinical. Sanitized, controlled, curated for an audience that paid for the promise of perfection. I carried my toolbox in one hand, my phone in the other, heart steady, pulse calm. The grease trap retrofit I'd installed days before was holding steady, but now it was time for proof. Time for the cameras. I ducked beneath the pass-through window into the kitchen proper, my coveralls blending into the swarm of cooks and dishwashers. Steam rose in halos around the heads of men in crisp white jackets, and the scent of sautéed garlic and rosemary filled the air. Pots clanged, orders shouted, knives chopped in a rhythmic hymn of culinary precision. I wove through the chaos, moving with purpose. No glance, no pause, just a plumber on a dinner-hour call, locating the vent and breaker box I'd scoped out earlier. The first camera went into the ceiling vent above the prep table. I pressed a tiny pinhole lens flush against the metal grill and secured it with tape the same color as the duct. A quick test on my phone showed the green light glowing. Good. It captured a perfect angle. The chef's flayed fish onto trays, pried slimy frog legs from bones, arranged plump shrimp on beds of crushed ice. Everything ready for the plating. I jiggled the vent, listened for any rattle. None. Perfect silence. Next, I moved to the breaker box in the back office. The cooks kept their secrets here, inventory lists, staff schedules, ledger books thick with numbers. I flipped open the metal door and found a loose screw at the bottom hinge. I wedged the camera beside it, lens aimed outward to capture Simone's private moments. A quick twist of the screwdriver, and the screw snapped back into place. I tapped my phone, green light. I was blind once. This time, I would see everything. I stepped away and let the night carry on without me. I found a shadowed corner outside the office door, pulled a black hoodie over my head, and watched as the staff trickled out after midnight. Plates cleared, the last spatulas washed, the final orders punched into the register. One by one, the doors closed until only the manager remained, double-checking the cash drawer. The kitchens grew quiet, the hum of the cooler compressors loud in the stillness. Simone swept through in a dark sheath dress that hugged her curves like a second skin, wine glass dangling from perfectly manicured fingers. She was beautiful, like a pandemic of grace in a room full of sweat and stain. But to me, she looked brittle. I watched her drift into the back office, and I followed silently, careful not to disturb the puddle of spilled water by the door. The soft click of the lock sounded too loud, but no one noticed. Through the thin door, I heard her heels tap on the glossy tile floor. The office light glowed gold in the gloom, illuminating her silhouette. She poured herself a generous glass of crimson wine, swirling the liquid so the crystal chime sang beneath her fingertips. Simone laughed softly as her phone buzzed. I recognized that ringtone, the one I downloaded for her birthday last year, the only bit of digital intimacy we'd shared. She glanced at the screen, her smile faltering for just a moment before she tucked the phone under her arm and took a measured sip. I stayed hidden in the hallway, body pressed against the cool wall, camera lens recording every motion. Her laughter echoed in the small room. I strained to hear words, but I was patient. This was surveillance, not interrogation. Justice, not vengeance. After a minute, she flipped open her laptop and tapped out a rapid message. I followed her eyes. Everything is set. Tomorrow's service will be spectacular. Victor's investors won't know what hit them. She paused, reading what she'd written, nodding as though memorizing lines in a play. Then she hit send. I exhaled, releasing tension I hadn't realized I'd held. I pressed a finger to my lips, quiet, and stepped back. The hallway swallowed me once more in shadow. I waited until the back office light blinked off, and then I slipped out through the main entrance like smoke on the wind. Out in the alley, the night air tasted of rain that had fallen earlier, slicking the pavement with ghostly reflections of the neon sign above. I leaned against the brick wall and checked the recordings. The footage was crisp, expired fish fillets rebranded as fresh catch of the day. Employees, some not yet 18, slipping through the doors at dawn with paperwork tucked under arms. A server counting bills behind closed doors, Simone's confident sips and triumphant smirk. Each frame was a testament. Every image a nail in their coffin. I copied the files onto a flash drive and slid it into my pocket. Then I pulled out my phone and sent the first batch of screenshots to the health inspector's anonymous tip email. The subject line read, "Urgent, food safety violations at Alonzo's flagship bistro." I attached images of mold creeping in the cooler corners, cracked floor tiles pooled with water, fish trays stamped "Use by" with yesterday's date. Before I could hesitate, I hit send. Next, I opened the Labor Department's complaint form. I filled in details about underage workers, names, approximate ages, shift times, side of the head photos I'd snapped in passing. I annotated the timestamps from the vent footage. I created a mock account for Ray D and submitted it. The click of submit echoed like a gavel in my chest. Then I moved to the IRS tip line on a separate browser tab. I uploaded documents showing wire transfers to shell corporations, invoices for ghost deliveries, suspicious loan payoffs. One more click, and the audit engines would to life. My phone battery blinked low. I backed up the rest of the night's footage to a secure cloud drive. Simone's silhouette lingered on the screen as the final shot. Beautiful. Betraying. I reminded myself that beauty did not excuse betrayal. I slipped the phone into my pocket and let the alley's hush envelop me. I climbed into the truck and tossed the empty flash drive onto the seat beside me. The engine started with a sigh. I drove away under the sway of street lamps, heart steady, mind clear. Victor's flagship would face unannounced inspections. The health department would swarm at dawn. The labor board would march in by afternoon. The IRS would take weeks, but eventually, their doors would rattle in the dead of night. By the time Simone read the headlines, Popular Bistro shut down for health violations. Labor Department investigates underage help. IRS audits Alonzo Enterprises. She would understand that cameras could see more than the naked eye. That every perfect smile she'd worn on a crystal glass had been caught in a frame. And when she watched those images unfold on her phone, she would know why I had never begged. I drove until the neon sign was a pinprick in the rearview mirror, then until the city lights blinked out behind me. Only when the road stretched dark and empty before my headlights did I allow my lungs to expand. I closed my eyes for a moment, tasted victory as bitter as the cake I'd left behind. Then I steered toward home, my new home of work boots and wrenches, ready for the next reveal, the next strike, the next camera that would capture the truth. I watched the morning sun stretch its fingers across my motel window, but I stayed cocooned in the hush of half-sleep. The city beyond that thin pane would soon buzz with accusations I'd planted overnight. I slid out of bed, boots heavy on the creaking floor, and gathered the evidence flash drive from the nightstand. Each recording was a fuse I'd lit, each anonymous tip a spark. All that remained was to nudge the dominoes until they fell in perfect sequence. By 8, I was parked in front of Alonzo's flagship bistro, the grand facade still draped in caution tape. Health inspectors had arrived before breakfast, condemning meat stored at unsafe temperatures. I wasn't there to gloat. I was there to observe. I watched suited lawyers unload briefcases from black SUVs, their faces masks of corporate dread. I saw Victor's shoulders slump when he read the inspector's report, the same man who once held himself like a colossus now shrinking beneath his own empire's collapse. I turned the ignition off, grabbed my wrench pouch, and slipped into the alley. Inside, flames of outrage flickered in the staff size. They dragged crates of ingredients from the kitchen to the street, tossing them into dumpsters with disgusted curses. I crouched by the dumpster lid, steady enough to wipe lint from my sleeve. I wasn't invisible. I was something more dangerous, a ghost in plain sight. By noon, the Department of Labor arrived. I'd sent them the photographs of underage workers in the back prep station. 2 boys barely past 16, sticky with sauce, their hands raw from scrubbing pants. They marched through the kitchen with clipboards and stern looks, interviewing staff and issuing citations. The sous chef pleaded ignorance, but ignorance was no defense when the evidence was timestamped on video. I stood by the entrance, arms crossed, as a line of workers filed out to talk, their proud posture replaced by trembling shoulders. That afternoon, I called a friend in finance to get a tip on the IRS audit process. Corporations often lay dormant until someone whispers shell company. When I sent the bank statements I'd acquired, wire transfers to far-flung holding companies, the IRS opened a formal investigation. It would take weeks, maybe months, before they froze accounts. But by then, Victor would be scrambling for collateral, his restaurants bleeding cash under repair fees, fines, and legal costs. I spent the rest of the day in my garage room, mapping out each upcoming inspection. I scribbled dates. Health reinspection on Wednesday, labor follow-up Friday, IRS notice giving 6 weeks. I laid the calendar pages on the desk and placed my wrench on top, as if I could tighten the timeline like a pipe joint. The plan felt precise, inevitable, a machine calibrated to break a man's will. That night, I uncapped a cheap bottle of whiskey in the dim glow of my bedside lamp. I sipped slowly, savoring the burn that whispered of both triumph and emptiness. I'd ignited mold swarms and corporate audits, but each victory felt hollow, without purpose beyond vengeance. I set the glass down and picked up my phone, scrolling through the day's news alerts. Health Code Enforcement shuts iconic bistro. Labor Department cites Alonzo Enterprises for child labor. IRS launches audit into Alonzo's shell corporations. Each headline hammered the final nails. I closed my eyes and felt the tremor of satisfaction pulse through me. But the real strike was still to come. The fire. I remembered the breaker panel I'd rigged in the back office weeks ago, programmed to trip under a slight overload. Electricity was volatile, unpredictable, but I'd set the conditions precisely. An extra lamp left on a timer, drawing just enough current to send a surge through the tampered circuit. Now I watched the clock, 2:33 a.m. I slipped into the alley behind the bistro, the night thick with tension. My breath curved in the cold air as I carried a small extension cord, its prongs gleaming. I ducked beneath the lip of the loading dock and found the exact junction I'd prepared. I plugged the cord into the hot socket and waited, hearing only my heartbeat. In seconds, a sharp pop echoed within the walls, followed by the hiss of overheating wires. A faint spark bloomed behind the panel before the breaker slammed off, plunging the office into darkness. I slipped away before the alarm could sound, slipping the cord into my pouch like a magician's trick. The falsified incident report filed the next morning, electrical malfunction likely caused by faulty wiring, would leave insurance investigators scrambling. Alonzo's insurer would suspect arson only when they lost more in claims than the restaurant was worth. By then, the bistro's insurance might cancel coverage entirely, leaving Victor personally liable for every shredded wire and scorched floorboard. I walked to my truck in the early hours as sirens wailed distantly, a choir of retribution singing my praise. I paused at the driver's door, placing my hand on its cool metal. Pain and purpose intertwined inside me, roots deep in betrayal. I'd broken him in stages. Mold for fear, citations for guilt, audits for desperation, and electricity for ending. Each step was calculated, surgical. In the rearview mirror, the bistro's neon sign flickered, once a beacon of wealth and taste, now a taunt in the night. I breathed in the cold air and held on to the silence that followed the storm. Tomorrow, Simone would learn that her investments had gone up in smoke, that the crystal glass she toasted with was shattered by consequences she never saw coming. I slid into the seat, started the engine, and exhaled the final breath of the night. My restless spirit stirred as I steered into the darkness, wrench still in hand, heart still burning. Vengeance was a fire that demanded fuel, and I had plenty of gas left in the tank. I arrived at Belgrano's just as the sky was bleeding pink into dusk, its antique lanterns flickering to life along the cobblestone street. The restaurant's facade was a swirl of ivy and polished mahogany, inviting patrons into what promised to be an evening of decadence and whispered secrets. I carried nothing but my wallet, my worn leather jacket, and the quiet momentum of a plan that had gathered force like a storm. I'd made the reservation under my real name, Mason Riley, because some lies deserved the light of day. Inside, the hostess led me past tables of murmured conversations and crystal chandeliers that cast prismatic patterns on white linen cloths. The clink of fine silverware against bone china sounded like applause for the unsuspecting. I released a breath I hadn't known I'd been holding and let the hostess guide me to my table, directly beside Victor and Simone. They were already immersed in candlelit conversation, her scarlet dress clinging to her curves in a way I once admired, his tailored suit pressed to perfection. They floated in their own private world of easy laughter and conspiratorial glances. I slid into the chair opposite them, laying my napkin across my lap with deliberate calm. Simone's eyes flicked up at me, recognition dawning like a sunburst across her features, surprise, disgust, fear, pride, an entire world in a single glance. Victor saw her reaction before he saw me, and his expression fractured from triumph into confusion, then anger. "Mason," Simone whispered, voice like honey dripped into acid. She placed a manicured hand against her chest, as though she might faint at the sight of me. Her diamond bracelet caught the candlelight and scattered it like broken promises. I picked up the menu and let it fall open, pretending to decide between the lamb rack and the sea bass. "Good evening," I said softly, voice low enough that only they heard. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Victor's jaw clenched. His eyes narrowed. "This is our table," he said, the wrongness in his tone hanging between us. I set the menu down and leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of the table. Actually, I said, tilting my head toward the hostess who hovered nearby, I specifically requested the table next to yours. The hostess gave a nervous nod and retreated, eyes flickering with curiosity. Simone's lips parted, but no words came. Her breath hitched, and she looked to Victor for backup. He opened his mouth, then closed it, as if searching for the right lie. I drank in their silence. It was worth more than a chorus of words. I folded my hands and let the candlelight dance off my palms. Red dress, I said, locking eyes with Simone. You look stunning. It's the same one I gave you on our first anniversary. I watched the flicker of memory cross her face, the moment she realized she'd been gifted more than diamonds and wine. She remembered the night we danced in the moonlight, her dress catching every star's reflection, the world spinning just for us. I remembered too. And how she traded that world for platefuls of applause and corporate investments. Victor's voice cut in, low and controlled. What do you want, Mason? I placed my wallet on the table and slid it across the polished wood. I want to give you each something you've been missing. I opened the wallet and pulled out 5 envelopes, thin and creased. I spread them on the table before Simone's trembling fingers. Each bore a label. Health Inspection Report, Labor Department Violation, IRS Audit Notice, Investor Withdrawal Confirmation, Insurance Fraud Investigation. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. Victor's face drained of color. He reached for the Insurance Fraud Investigation envelope, tearing it open. His eyes skimmed the page, and he let out a strangled curse that ricocheted off the chandeliers. What is this? Simone hissed, panic and betrayal warring in her gaze. I folded my arms again, breathing in the scent of her perfume, jasmine, and something cold. It's everything you invested in, I said softly. The soy-glazed salmon you praised as farm-to-table fresh? Mold in the walk-in cooler. The Michelin star vision you bragged about? Labor violations up the wazoo. The corporate juggernaut you built your image on? Shell companies and vanishing profits. Victor slammed his fist on the table. The candle trembled, sending sparks of wax onto the pristine linen. You're lying, he snarled. This is sabotage. I stood, the chair scraping the floor, and gathered the envelopes. This is truth, I said. My voice was quiet, authoritative, unyielding. You built your empire on lies. You humiliated me on my birthday for being temporary. You reduced me to a punchline while you and Victor sipped wine on the profits. But I'm not temporary. I pressed the last envelope into Simone's hand. Our daughter isn't temporary. Her weekends with me start next month. I filed the custody papers yesterday. Simone's eyes filled with tears, but they were not for me. They were for the world she'd lost in her pursuit of false worth. Victor's shoulders slumped, the last of his bravado deflated. The diners at nearby tables peeked over menus and shoulder-bladed stares, their forks paused mid-air as they soaked in the drama. Belgrano's glossy veneer cracked under the weight of truth. I folded my jacket and tucked the envelopes into an inside pocket. I unbuttoned my collar, loosening the tie I never wore. Victor swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. Simone looked away, face pale but defiant, as if mapping her next move. I didn't wait for it. I turned and walked out into the night, leaving the clatter of dropped silverware and whispered gossip in my wake. Outside, the lanterns glowed like distant stars. I walked to my truck parked on the street and paused. I exhaled, letting the tension drain from my lungs. For a moment, I closed my eyes and listened to the city's hum, the late diners on patios, the taxi horns in the distance, the pulse of life moving on. When I opened my eyes, I felt a sense of finality settle in my bones. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. As I pulled away, I caught one last glimpse of Simone at the window, red dress and shattered world behind her. A tear tracked down her cheek, and I realized she finally understood what I'd known all along. Being a man isn't about diamonds or restaurants or public applause. It's about standing up for your worth, even when the world tells you otherwise. I drove into the night, each mile taking me further from betrayal and closer to the quiet promise of rebuilding. The red dress faded in my rearview mirror, a beacon of a life I once lost and a testament to the power of truth. And as the city lights blurred behind me, I gripped the wheel tighter, ready for whatever lay ahead, because some victories are worth every wrench, every camera, every secret unveiled. The morning after Belgrano's spectacle, I woke alone in my rented room above Petrov's garage, the first slivers of dawn creeping through the single, grimy window. My duffel lay open on the floor, its contents scattered. A wrench here, an envelope there, my daughter's drawings folded and tucked into a breast pocket of my old work shirt. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence settle around me, a quiet so complete it hummed. Outside, the city stirred. The distant rumble of buses, the clatter of metal on concrete as garbage trucks began their rounds, the occasional shout of a street vendor setting up for the morning rush. But inside these walls, there was only stillness, a blank canvas for what came next. I dressed in the same clothes I meant to change out of but somehow never did, a tired navy tee, faded jeans, and scuffed boots. My wrench set hung at my side like a talisman. I pocketed the last of the envelopes I'd handed Simone and Victor at Belgrano's. Even now, they felt heavy with consequence. I left the room without speaking to Petrov, slipping down the stairs and out to the alley. The garage door rose, and I slid into my truck, its cab already warmed by idling heat. I drove past the boarded-up storefronts and sleepy diners, my hands steady on the wheel as I navigated today's task list. I started at the county courthouse, clutching a manila envelope stamped custody filing. The clerk gave me a sympathetic nod as she accepted it, and I watched the document slip between hushed piles of divorces and real estate transfers. In 30 days, I'd have a hearing date. The thought of legally binding weekends with Sierra brought a sting of hope to my chest, as if I'd finally laid a foundation I could build on. I left without fanfare. The envelope's weight now shifted from my pocket to the court's registry system. Next, I headed to the lawyer's office I'd called in the wake of the bistro collapse. The building was austere, its halls carpeted in muted gray, walls lined with framed degrees and plaques. I sat across from the attorney, a sharp woman whose suit was as crisp as the contract she slid toward me. She went over every detail, divorce terms, asset division, visitation rights, her pen moving with purpose across the pages. I asked about alimony and property, and she shook her head. You waive those. You want nothing but your daughter. Her voice was firm, approving, as though she'd been waiting for someone finally to choose what mattered most. I signed the agreement and felt a barometer shift in my soul. The paperwork was done. The legal battle had begun. Outside, the sky had brightened to a clear blue as I climbed back into the truck. I drove south to the small bungalow where I'd first started work under the alias Ray Dalton. The elderly woman who lived there greeted me at the door with a smile worn by decades but bright with gratitude. She held out a small wooden box and said, "I think you left this last time." Inside was the note I'd slipped into her drawer and a handful of old photographs of her late husband, standing beside her in happier times. Her eyes glistened as she recalled how he loved a plumber who kept their water flowing. I told her the note was meant for her and anyone else who needed a friend. She pressed the box into my hands and said, "Keep rebuilding, son." I left with the box on my dashboard, an echo of kindness in a week defined by confrontation. By midday, I returned to Petrov's garage to pick up my paycheck for the plumbing and mechanical work I'd done. Petrov slapped a thick envelope in my hand without looking up. "Keep at it," he muttered, and I recognized in his rough tone a grudged respect. I counted the cash in my truck's cab, enough to cover rent and gas for another 2 months. Enough to rebuild. I tucked the bills into a secure pocket. I spent the afternoon under the sink of a single mother's trailer out past Edison Creek. The leaky pipe was a minor inconvenience for her, but it was everything to her toddler who splashed in puddles while she cooked dinner. I tightened the joint, replaced the washer, and tested the flow, steady, sure. The mother watched with relief, pressing both hands against her heart. She offered me a thermos of coffee, and we talked about her hopes for her son's future. As I drove away, her gratitude warmed me more than any bottle of whiskey. That evening, I returned to the bungalow where Simone and Victor once laughed behind closed doors. I didn't need to knock. The place was empty, the rooms echoing with absence. I walked through the living room where I'd built that patio table, now splintered and weathered. I ran my hand along its edge, recalling the labor and love I'd poured into every joint and beam. I slipped on my gloves and set to work. Boards had warped in rain, screws had loosened, and the stain had peeled away. I sanded the surface, replaced rotten planks, tightened every bolt, and applied fresh sealant. The smell of wood and varnish filled the dusk. As I worked, the setting sun painted the room gold, spotlighting the grain I'd once sealed with a promise of permanence. When the last coat dried, I stood back and admired the table's renewed strength. It looked like the man I'd become, weathered but unbroken. I imagined Sierra sitting at one end, me at the other, our hands brushing over teacups instead of laughter meant to wound. I packed my tools, turned off the lights, and locked the door behind me. The house was hushed once more, but now it felt ready to hold new stories. I drove back to the motel, the pale moon guiding me. As I climbed into bed, I felt both the ache of yesterday's battles and the quiet promise of tomorrow's rebuild. I clutched the wooden box on the nightstand, the photographs inside a reminder that even broken things could be mended. I closed my eyes and let sleep carry me, knowing that the man called Mason Riley was no longer temporary. He was here to stay, rebuilding in silence, one silent, determined step at a time. The first weekend with Sierra arrived like a quiet sunrise, tentative and full of promise. I parked my truck in front of her mother's new apartment, a small unit painted sage green with a balcony that overlooked a narrow alley. Sierra stood on the steps, clutching a stuffed giraffe and wearing her favorite pink hoodie that made her look like spring incarnate. When she saw me, her eyes widened, then softened, and she ran the last few steps to throw her arms around my waist. I felt her small body press against me, and in that instant, the months of planning, fighting, and waiting dissolved. I was simply Dad. We hugged for what felt like a lifetime, but in reality lasted only a few seconds. Then Sierra pulled back, examined my face with solemn curiosity, and whispered, "Did you really fix bathrooms for a living?" I grinned and ruffled her hair, the way I used to when she was small enough to giggle at such gestures. "I sure do," I said. "So today, I thought we'd do something special." She bounced on her toes, watched me slide the duffel from the back seat, and peeked inside. "Is that tools?" she asked, voice pitched somewhere between awe and amusement. I nodded, feeling a flare of pride. "These are my best friends. Today, you get to help me fix something." She hesitated, gaze darting between me and the duffel, then nodded determinedly. We climbed the 4 flights of stairs to her apartment, the hallway echoing with our footsteps. Her mother greeted us at the door, courteous but wary. I laid out the rules quickly. I was Dad on weekends, not her therapist or adversary. Sierra would stay with me until Sunday evening, and I'd return her in one piece. Her mother exhaled and handed me a grocery bag full of snacks and a thermos. "Thank you for doing this," she murmured. I nodded, understanding that trust had been earned in letters and courtrooms, but sealed in moments like these. Inside the apartment, the kitchen sink sat with a steady drip, drip, drip that echoed like a metronome of neglect. I knelt under the sink, removed the P-trap, and showed Sierra how a simple rubber washer could wear out and cause a leak. She peered at the twisted pipe with fascination, then held the new washer in her tiny palm. "Like this?" she asked. I guided her fingers to the threads and helped her tighten the slip nut. The leak stopped. Sierra's face lit up the way a sunrise ignites the sky. "I did it," she exclaimed, voice echoing in the cramped cabinet. We spent the rest of Saturday morning fixing small things, a wobbly cabinet door, a loose doorknob, squeaky hinges on the bedroom closet. Each time Sierra asked a question, I answered patiently. "Why does the trap hold water? How do you stop a hinge from squeaking?" She listened, absorbed every explanation, and even took out a small notebook to write down Mason's plumbing wisdom. I watched her scribble, a future engineer perhaps, and felt a surge of hope that her world could be one of creation, not betrayal. After lunch, turkey sandwiches and apple slices, Sierra announced she was hungry for adventure. I suggested we ride the city bus to Edison Creek Park, where the creek curled through willow trees and small fish darted in the shallows. She grinned and said, "Can I steer the bus?" I laughed and said, "Not today, but maybe one day." We climbed aboard, she by the window, me beside her, and she pointed at every landmark, the gas station where I'd paid cash for gas, the boardwalk where we'd once walked in happier times, the green-tiled roof of Petrov's garage. "That's where you sleep," she said with mock seriousness. I winked and said, "Only when I'm on the job." At the park, we found a fallen log by the water's edge. I took off my boots and rolled up my jeans, letting the cool creek water swirl around my ankles. Sierra dipped her toes in and squealed when a tiny fish brushed her skin. I taught her how to skip stones, turning the task into a friendly competition. She won the first round. I won the second. Then we sat on the bank and ate peanut butter sandwiches and sipped juice from the thermos, talking about school, friends, and how she missed having two parents who could fix everything. I told her that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, but that didn't change how much they cared. She nodded, large eyes thoughtful, then changed the subject to her favorite cartoons. On the way home, Sierra leaned her head against the window, eyelids heavy. "Can we fix something else tomorrow?" she mumbled. I smiled and whispered, "Absolutely." Sunday morning, I packed my duffel once more and loaded Sierra into the truck. We drove to a small community center where they needed help fixing a leaky faucet in the children's bathroom. The center director greeted us warmly and handed Sierra an oversized pair of safety goggles. "Your assistant is here," I said, helping Sierra put them on. We knelt under the sink together. I guided her hand as she tightened the packing nut on the faucet stem. Water stopped spraying when she closed the valve. The director clapped and said, "We could use more plumbers like you two." Sierra beamed and said, "We're a team." Back in the truck, Sierra sat in her car seat, clutching a small certificate the director had given her, Honorary Junior Plumber. She waved it like a flag. I felt the corners of my chest stretch with pride. We returned her to her mother's apartment in the late afternoon. Sierra climbed out, scooped me into a tight hug, and pressed the certificate into my hand. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered. I knelt and kissed her forehead. "Thank you, kiddo. You did great." As I drove away, the city lights began to glow against the approaching dusk. My wrench set sat beside me, not needed anymore. This weekend had been about something far more important than fixing leaks. It had been about building trust, teaching resilience, and showing Sierra that leaks could be stopped, doors could be tightened, and hinges could be oiled. But more than that broken things could be made whole again. In my rearview mirror, I saw her silhouette through the window, holding the certificate high. And I realized that weekends and wrenches were just the beginning of the life we'd rebuild together. I woke to the sound of my daughter's laughter drifting through the open window, mingling with the scent of dawn and dew-kissed grass. Sierra stood on the porch, bare feet tapping against the weathered wood as she chased a stray firefly under the soft light of early morning. I watched her, wrapped in a faded work shirt and clutching a mug of black coffee, and understood that this moment, quiet, unhurried, alive, was the truest measure of my strength. The room behind me was simple, a single bed, a sturdy desk, and the wooden box of photographs on the nightstand. I stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking under my weight, and knelt beside Sierra. She handed me the tin jar where she collected fireflies, its glass walls shimmering with tiny lights. "Mommy said they bring hope," she whispered, eyes shining. I cupped the jar and nodded, feeling warmth bloom in my chest. "They do," I said, releasing them one by one into the air. Each firefly traced a glowing arc across the sky, as if spelling out the future we were building together. After breakfast, pancakes drizzled with syrup and laughter, I loaded Sierra into the truck and drove to a small hardware store where I purchased a planter box, potting soil, and packets of marigold seeds. We found a sunny spot in my backyard, a patch of earth waiting to be tended. I showed her how to dig a shallow trench, place each seed carefully, and cover it with soil. Her small hands worked alongside mine, and in her concentration I saw the same determination that had driven me through heartbreak and retribution. As we watered the seeds, I thought back on the journey that had brought me here. The birthday patio, the gas station motels, the aliases and spycraft, the cameras planted in vents. Each wrench turn, each whispered tip to inspectors, each manipulated fuse had carved out a path from humiliation to vindication. But it was this, planting seeds with my daughter, nurturing life, that defined real strength. We left the hardware store with more than soil and seeds. Sierra insisted on a small basil plant for the windowsill, and I couldn't say no. By midday, the sun beat hot overhead, and we paused for sandwiches on the back porch. Sierra lay across my lap, head propped on my knees, and asked about the red dress and the restaurant called Belgrano's. I told her the truth gently, how some places are beautiful on the surface but hide poisonous secrets underneath, and how sometimes people wear pretty clothes to mask their lies. She frowned, but nodded as though she understood. Then she started giggling at the shape of a cloud that looked like a dancing frog, and the world felt right again. That afternoon, I went to retrieve the last of my equipment from Petrov's garage. I handed back the loaned tools, pipe cutters, sealant guns, extra length of copper tubing, and thanked him for his trust. He grunted, as he always did, then paused. "You did good," he said. His words were rough as gravel, but carried weight. I nodded, knowing that his respect was earned the hard way. I climbed into my truck, leaving the tools behind, and realized that the wrench set that had once been my weapon of vengeance was now a symbol of reconstruction. Back home, Sierra and I assembled a makeshift scarecrow from old work shirts stuffed with straw, placing it beside the marigold seeds. She painted a smiling face on its burlap head and crowned it with a floppy hat. As we worked, she chatted about school projects and the friends she'd invited for her birthday party next week. Her excitement bubbled over, and I felt the contours of my future coalesce, a life not of retaliation but of renewal. In the cool of the evening, I sat on the porch with Sierra curled beside me. We watched as fireflies reappeared, drawn to the light of our porch lamp. She nestled into my side and whispered, "I like it here, Daddy." I wrapped an arm around her and looked out at the garden, tiny green shoots already pushing through the soil. "Me too," I said. "Me too." Night settled with a hush, and I tucked Sierra into the guest bed before stepping outside alone. I leaned against the railing, the wooden surface smooth under my palm, and closed my eyes. The distant hum of the city was softened here, muffled by trees and open sky. I let the silence settle into me, carrying with it the echoes of every chapter I'd lived. The laughter that wasn't mine, the humiliation, the plans for sabotage, the relentless drive for justice, and finally, the quiet work of rebuilding. A single firefly drifted past, its glow pulsing like a heartbeat. I followed its journey until it vanished into the night. In that moment, I understood that strength didn't roar. It whispered. It planted seeds. It rebuilt broken things. It held a daughter's hand and let go of old grudges. I turned and walked inside, closing the door on the porch's gentle glow. The house was dark and still, but in the living room lay the framed photographs of Sierra's mother, of weekends at Edison Creek, of our laughter and tears. I touched the glass lightly, reverence in my fingertips, and remembered that every broken piece could be mended. As I climbed into my own bed, the last thought before sleep claimed me was a promise. I would continue to rebuild, not just homes and drains, but lives and trust. Because being a man wasn't about power or wealth. It was about resilience, humility, and love carried in the quiet moments between battles. And here, in the strength of silence, I had found my truth.